This is the remarkable story of the world's longest surviving alliance. A story of two seafaring peoples located on the very edges of Europe. England and Portugal have been formal allies for 650 years. It is an alliance that was forged in the heat of the 100 Years' War. In 1385, English knights and longbowmen stood alongside the Portuguese army in their fight against Castile.
Had Juan of Castile won at Aljubarrota, that would have meant land invasion of England, for certain.
With its river route to the interior and its ocean links to the world, the city of Porto has been central to the story.
It took a few years before they discovered the big powerful wines of the Douro.
The Napoleonic Wars brought both challenges and triumphs.
While the French were pinned down, we have the opportunity to cross upward and downward. That was a triumph for the French.
British merchant families have lived in Porto for many generations.
I was born British, but my heart is very much Portuguese.
This is the story of extraordinary people.
Because he was a spy for Wellington, wasn't he? A spy for Wellesley.
Yes, because he spoke 6 languages, so he was someone that could very well build a network of spies.
The history jumps out, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
The story of the alliance is a story far richer than I could have imagined. The spirit of the 1373 alliance and all the subsequent treaties remains. The bond is strategic, but it has also been commercial and cultural, and it has been forged with 650 years of shared history, shared understanding, and shared sacrifice. This is the Castelo São Jorge in Lisbon, and it is where the story begins. Originally, a Moorish castle stood on this site. Although the first formal alliance wasn't sealed until 1373, the story of Anglo-Portuguese friendship began more than 200 years earlier. And it began here at Lisbon's famous Castelo São Jorge. Until the mid-12th century, much of the Iberian Peninsula had been under Islamic rule, following the Moorish invasions of the early 8th century. The Reconquista, the retaking of occupied land by Christian armies, had begun in 868, but by 1147 only a very small area in the north had been recovered. That was all to change, thanks to a deal with an army of English knights. In 1147, the King of Portugal, Afonso Henriques, persuaded several thousand English knights to fight under his banner and to capture Lisbon from the Moors. They joined a Portuguese army that also included crusading knights from France, Flanders, and the German lands. In exchange for their assistance, Alphonse offered them all the treasure and booty that they could loot, as well as all the money that they could raise from ransoms. With its high, imposing walls atop a steep hill, Lisbon's castle was a stronghold of Moorish resistance. The siege was long and dramatic, with the Crusaders bringing up trebuchets to bombard the walls, and the Moors countering with cavalry sorties to raid the Crusaders' camp and set fire to their siege engines. Just imagine hundreds of spirited horses streaming over this bridge, deafening thunder of hooves and a blinding blizzard of dust pierced only by the fiery flames of their torches. It really must have been quite a spectacle. The siege began on July the 1st. Just over 3 months later, on the 21st of October, the Moors surrendered on condition that they were allowed to march out freely and unharmed. The problem was that the terms of the surrender didn't allow for the Crusaders taking any booty. Instead, Afonso Henriques offered grants of land to those Crusaders who wanted to settle in Portugal and help build this new Christian country. Many English knights took up the offer and, with their large retinues, settled in the area around Lisbon, establishing an enduring Anglo-Portuguese community.
A community that became the bridgehead for centuries of mutual trade. In 1308, King Dinis of Portugal signed the first trade agreement with England. And in 1373, the first formal alliance was signed between England's King Edward III and Portugal's King Ferdinand I. The alliance that has its 650th anniversary this year. Signed at a time of conflict, it binds both parties to be friends to friends and enemies to enemies, and to assist, maintain, and uphold each other mutually by sea and by land.
England was in the midst of the 100 Years' War, pursuing Edward III's claim to the French crown. So why was an alliance with Portugal thought necessary, especially an alliance that pledged military aid? After all, Portugal is a very long way from France.
To find out, I've come to meet an historian who has studied these events, Antonio Oliveira.
England didn't have a standing navy at the time, as you know. It relied on merchant vessels, cogs usually, outfitted for naval warfare. Portugal, on the other hand, had one of the very best navies in medieval Europe.
And that mattered to England because Portugal's neighbour, Castile, had allied itself with France. Spain had not yet emerged as a nation. Castile was Portugal's largest neighbour and also a belligerent rival.
The Castilian navy was also pretty powerful and was of considerable benefit to France. The English derived a lot of their wealth from trade with Portugal, which was being disrupted by Castilian raiding.
England's King Edward also needed safe passage for his armies across the English Channel to the fighting in France. Both England and Portugal had pressing strategic interests for an alliance against this Franco-Castilian threat. The alliance was also motivated by the personal ambitions of one man, John of Gaunt. Gaunt, King Edward III of England's third son, was a major power player and the chief broker of the alliance. By marriage, he was a claimant to the Castilian crown, a claim that Portugal supported. To further uphold that claim, an expeditionary force numbering 3,000 men was sent from England to Portugal in 1381. Its twin aims were to defend the border and to press Gaunt's quest to become the King of Castile.
Tragically, this mercenary army were a poorly led, unruly and disreputable mob. Many were former criminals and only there for the plunder.
There were reports of looting and atrocities by the English against the Portuguese population. It was an inauspicious start to the alliance. However, 3 years later, on the 14th of August 1385, the English had the chance to redeem themselves by providing critical support to Portugal at the Battle of Aljubarrota. They were up against a fearsome enemy.
Castile's ally France had joined the fray and sent a massive army in support of the invasion. It included over 2,000 heavy cavalry. Can you imagine that? 2,000 powerful snorting horses, over 2,000 powerful men glinting in plate armour. It was a seemingly unstoppable force.
Portugal had a new king, King João, portrayed in this painting meeting with John of Gaunt. João had mustered an army of around 6,000 men to face the threat. However, he was severely outmatched by a Franco-Castilian army of a little over 20,000 men. He was outnumbered by more than 3 to 1. In support of Portugal, John of Gaunt sent a contingent of English knights together with around 600 longbowmen. French cavalry had good reason to fear the power of English longbowmen. They had felt their sting nearly 40 years earlier at the Battle of Crécy, and again a decade later at Poitiers.
Even so, 2,000 horses, which is what the French had at Aljubarrota, should have had no trouble riding down a few hundred archers, flattening them like trampled corn. But they didn't, and they couldn't, and the reason is this.
The archers had defended their positions with a minefield of pits.
Tell me about the pits. The pits were important at Aljubarrota.
Yeah, they were very important. The archaeological excavations at the battle site have revealed hundreds of pits, almost like this, a little bit deeper. Sometimes with a stake in the middle. And these pits were laid out in front of what we now know to have been the archers' positions.
Any horse coming through here, even at this depth, is going to break a leg, throw the rider.
And the psychological effect of this was that the entire Franco-Castilian army was funneled towards this very narrow front. Only the men in front could fight, and this not only negated their advantage in numbers.
Because of the crowding from the back.
Precisely.
If you force them into a funnel.
Yeah, there's pressing, there's chaos, and we know, for example, that a lot of the Castilian dead were found without any wounds on their bodies. They died from compression.
Fighting began at 10 o'clock in the morning and went on until nightfall. Throughout the day, there were many twists and turns, but in the end, the tactics and the fighting grit of the smaller force prevailed, and King João, with English support, won the day.
In England, Aljubarrota is one of the lesser-known battles of the 100 Years' War, but how much did the outcome matter to England?
It was absolutely vital in ensuring the safety of England as an independent kingdom. Had Juan of Castile won at Aljubarrota, then the Portuguese and Castilian thrones would have been united under the same ruler, who was allied with Valois France. That would have meant that the French would have had at their disposal the combined might of the Portuguese and Castilian navies, which in turn would mean an unimaginable land invasion of England, for certain. And we know that that invasion was being planned. In fact, in the very same day that the Treaty of Windsor was signed, the Portuguese pledged to send the English war galleys to patrol the Channel in anticipation of a possible invasion.
The value of the alliance had been proven, and its pledges continued, among them a declaration for true, mutual and perpetual friendships and leagues of sincere affection. In the following year, 1386, King João was married to John of Gaunt's daughter, Philippa of Lancaster. They were married in Porto Cathedral. The marriage is commemorated in a rather surprising setting. This is Porto's São Bento train station. It is famous for its azulejo tiles depicting important moments in Portuguese history.
These tiles behind me here commemorate the celebrations after the ceremony. Here you can see King João and his new queen, Philippa, both crowned, riding side by side as equals through the streets of Porto to cheering crowds. It was the beginning of a new era, and Queen Philippa was popular in her new country. She had the ear of the king, she was influential, and she was powerful. And I love it that this English noblewoman, who few in England have even heard of, is seen here every day by thousands of commuters and tourists. It's a strong image and an enduring legacy.
Following the marriage, the alliance was bolstered by the Treaty of Windsor, signed at Windsor Castle in England. This secured even stronger guarantees of military aid. Moreover, Queen Philippa promoted trade between England and Portugal, increasing the commercial ties that endure to this day.
Here on the waterfront in Porto, there would have been a fleet of small trading vessels, and just imagine it. There would also have been a noisy, toiling legion of dock workers as they heaved and hauled and loaded and unloaded their cargoes amidst the shouts and cries of merchants haggling for better prices. Tin, alabaster, card, wool and woolen cloth, these were the staples of the English, and For the Portuguese, it was oranges and leather and olive oil and wine.
Despite the longevity of the alliance, there have been bumps in the road. For 60 years, between 1580 and 1640, Portugal was under Spanish rule, a period when Spain was in conflict with England. There were 12 Portuguese ships in the Spanish Armada that attempted, unsuccessfully, an invasion of England in 1588. The following year, Sir Francis Drake led a privately financed expedition to destroy the remnants of the Armada ships that had made it home. Those who signed up were promised a share of the treasure. After raiding Corunna, where they sank 13 ships, this mercenary force of privateers moved on to Lisbon. Drake blockaded the harbour so that no ships could get in or out of Lisbon, and another English force, one that had landed further north, came overland to attack the city.
11,000 men under English command attacked Lisbon. It was argued that it would prompt a Portuguese uprising against their Spanish overlords, but that didn't materialize. Lisbon's garrison of 7,000 Portuguese and Spanish troops held out. Once again, the Castelo São Jorge was a vital bastion of defense.
Its long-range guns pounding the English raiders over a mile away. In 1640, Portugal's independence and its monarchy were restored. In 1660, the monarchy was also restored in Britain with the crowning of King Charles II. And in the following year, the Portuguese-British alliance received a considerable boost with the marriage of Charles to Portugal's Catherine of Braganza. As part of her dowry, the Portuguese territory of Bombay, present-day Mumbai, was gifted to the king. Charles, in turn, gifted it to the East India Company, thus beginning a new chapter of British interests in India. Tea was not yet grown in India. At the time, tea came only from China.
Everyone knows about us Brits and our obsession with tea, but it was Catherine of Braganza who first made tea drinking fashionable in Britain. You see, the Portuguese had been trading with China since the early 16th century, and they developed their passion for tea long before the British.
However, few things characterise the bond between Britain and Portugal more than the trade and consumption of port wine. Portuguese wine had been traded for centuries, but it was events in 1667 that spurred the development of port wine as we know it today. A trade war had resulted in a ban on the import of French wines into Britain.
The British needed to source their wine from elsewhere, and British merchants already living in Portugal were quick to supply the demand. This is Taylor's Port Lodge, where casks of port are stored for aging. Cristo, bom dia. It's quite an art moving these barrels, and he makes it look incredibly easy. Taylor's is one of the original port houses, tracing its history back to 1692, and I've come here today to meet its managing director, Adrian Bridge.
Portugal was shipping wine to England. In the early days, it was something called Red Portugal. And I have a sort of example of it here. It was much lighter wine that was made sort of up in the northern part of Portugal. I'm going to try some.
I mean, to me, that's an extremely pleasant red wine, but not yet port.
It's not yet port. It's a much lighter example. It's what would have been traded in the mid-17th century after Oliver Cromwell's treaty with Portugal, where wool and wines were being traded between Britain and Portugal. And the people were on the coast making this lighter style of wine. It took a few years before they discovered the big, powerful wines of the Douro.
Which is what the British market wanted.
British market were looking for a bit more strength, a little bit more fruit, a little bit more richness. And by going into the interior of the country, you've got riper grapes, bigger fruit, and therefore the capacity to make much more powerful wines.
Portugal's Douro Valley is where the grapes are grown to make true port wines. The valley sits the other side of the Marão mountain range in Portugal's interior. It has an entirely different climate from the coastal vineyards, with bitterly cold winters and searingly hot summers. This produces grapes with extra thick skins. These retain more sugar, resulting in a robust, rich and sweet wine with a high alcohol content. Apart from the quality of the grapes, what makes port port is that it is a fortified wine. Brandy is added to the mix.
When a grape starts to ferment with its natural yeasts, it'll slowly convert all the sugar in the grape into alcohol. Okay? And that's a process that could take 2 or 3 weeks. But what we do is something called fortification. So once about half of the sugar has converted into alcohol, which actually only takes about 3.5, 4 days, we in fact add a neutral grape spirit. It's like a very strong brandy, 77% alcohol. And what that does, when you add it to the wine, it raises the alcohol level up to about 20%. Yeast cells can't live above 15 or 16. So you kill off all the yeast cells and you get left with unfermented grape sugar. And that's what makes all port sweet. And what you'll see on these two, you can suddenly see here, look at the difference between the port with that big, rich colour and the
red Portugal. So this one's the red Portugal,
yeah,
and this one is port wine proper.
It's port wine proper. It's a bigger wine, there's more richness, there's more lovely fruit there. And that, of course, became very popular in the British market because it just has more body, more weight, more character.
When ready for bottling, the wine is tapped and inspected. The style of port varied according to whether it was aged in casks like this or in massive vats. Wooden barrels are porous to air, and it is all about developing the flavour according to how much contact the wine has with oxygen. Tawny ports are produced in the smaller casks and ruby ports in the large vats. Adrian offered me a fine vintage tawny to try.
And there you're getting the influence of oxygen in the aging process.
Well, I have to say, that's to my taste. I like that a lot.
3% of port is lost to evaporation each year. It is called the Angel's Share. The port lodges are situated on the shadier southern side of the River Douro in Vila Nova de Gaia. The city of Porto faces directly opposite on the north bank of the river. In order to bring barrels of port from the vineyards upstream in the Douro Valley to the lodges here, special boats called barcos rebelos were designed to take advantage of the fast-flowing spring current and to navigate the hull-splitting rapids. Today, the river has been tamed and hushed by dams. There are now bridges, tunnels, trains and roads. However, it was once boats like this that splashed and crashed their way downstream to bring their precious cargo to the port lodges here, prior to shipping to Britain.
It was an extremely hazardous journey, and there were many accidents, both people and barrels overboard. Anticipating this, they didn't fill the barrels. They left enough air in each barrel so that in the event that it did come overboard, it would float. And the barrels floated downstream with the current and arrived here in Vila Nova de Gaia, where they could be retrieved from the water and carried off up to the lodges.
Few moments have asked more of the alliance than the threat of Napoleon's armies. When the French invaded Portugal in 1807, Britain responded with an expeditionary force under the command of Sir Arthur Wellesley, later to become the Duke of Wellington. He formed and led an Anglo-Portuguese army which drove the French out of Portugal after victory at the Battle of Vimeiro in 1808. The very next year, the French returned under the command of Marshal Soult. In March 1809, Soult's army attacked and took Porto. After marching his army 80 miles in 4 days, Wellesley prepared the counterattack.
This is the Serra do Pilar monastery in Villanova de Gaia, on the south bank of the river overlooking the city of Porto. Porto, a city occupied by the French. And it was here, to this high, commanding position, that Sir Arthur Wellesley brought his Anglo-Portuguese army on the 12th of May, 1809. Porto's famous high bridges had yet to be built. The only way to cross the river was a pontoon bridge down there, a series of boats all moored together. It was called a Ponte de Barcos.
In order to secure their position on the north bank, the French destroyed the bridge with explosives. At the time, many Portuguese were fleeing the city to get to this side of the river. Many died. The opposing armies continued to fire across the river from opposite banks.
Wellesley's guns fired on the French positions. The French fired on Wellesley's positions. But Soult considered himself safe from direct assault. He didn't think there was any crossing of the river. He thought he'd commandeered all the boats and taken them to the north bank of the river. Wellesley, however, sent scouts out that way. It was just farmland over there. But those scouts found something very useful.
They discovered a fatal oversight in the French defences. Professor Sergio Coelho has made a study of what happened next.
They took a skiff with a few Portuguese soldiers and they crossed here and they found 4 barges moored in the north bank, just above here, without any guards.
Soult had left 4 big he thought he'd got all the boats.
Yes, but he left 4 barges without any guards. Wellesley said to Walters, well, let the lads cross the river.
How many in a day? How many with these 4 barges? How many people?
During the day we have over there almost 2,000 men. They took positions on the seminary.
So that gives them a strong position on the French side of the river.
Yes.
They had managed to create a bridgehead. The seminary, a college for Catholic priests, sits high on the other side of the river. The building remains, although the modern bridge is a convenience that was not available to Wellesley's men. They had to row across and scale the cliffs. Occupation of the seminary gave Wellesley a considerable tactical advantage.
They took positions and they were covered by the artillery that was posted in the Serra do Pilar.
So the French were trapped in a crossfire?
Yes. While the French were pinned down, we have the opportunity to cross upward and downward. That was a trap for the French.
And that then drives the French out of Porto.
Yes.
Victory.
Victory. Completely.
The Battle of Porto was an astonishing success for Wellesley and also for the Alliance. But the French didn't give up their Portuguese ambitions. The following year, in 1810, the French were back for a 3rd time with an army under the command of Marshal Massena. Once again, Wellesley's Anglo-Portuguese army defeated them and finally, in 1811, chased the French out of Portugal once and for all. Military triumphs were important, but it was trade that sustained the alliance. Here in Porto, British merchants have been established for centuries.
This elegant building is the British Port Shippers Club, also known as the Factory House. It is a quintessential outpost of Britain in the heart of a Portuguese city.
I've come here to meet Natasha Robertson Bridge. She is the 13th generation to be involved in the management of the Taylor's family port business.
The Association of British Merchants goes right back to 1666.
And why is it called the Factory House?
Well, the merchants, the traders, were known as factors, and this is where they did their factoring, their trading.
It's an impressive space. When was it built?
It was built between 1785 and 1790.
You say 1790-ish.
So 1790,
But this
yes.
board says 1811.
During the Peninsular War in 1808, the house was occupied by the French, and they removed most of the contents. They were stolen or they were damaged.
And probably drank most of the port.
Drank most of our port, sadly, and all the boards were removed. So the boards were put back in 1811 when the house was retaken by the British.
I also spy a familiar name over here, which is your name.
I was the first female to be admitted as a full member in December 2010. My first AGM was in 2011.
200 years exactly.
200 years exactly, which is rather nice. And then I became the first female treasurer in 2017.
Show me more of the place.
British merchants in Porto traded across the world.
Where are we now?
We are in the map room, very aptly named.
Magnificent maps.
1800s.
Cannonballs. French, I presume?
French, and there are a few of those hanging around the city. One of those actually came through the sitting room window of the house I live in at the moment.
No.
Yeah, extraordinary.
That must make you feel very connected to the history of this place. I mean, and you're very much part of it, aren't you? I mean, this tradition of the port families.
Yeah, we have many generations have lived here, and we all went to the local British school, the Oporto British School, which was actually established in 1894. And we have here a photograph of my great uncle and my grandfather, who were the first students at the Oporto British School.
Which one's which?
So they're down here in the corner, the Robertsons.
So you grew up here, grew up speaking Portuguese, but you went to a British school. Do you think of yourself as British or as Portuguese or both?
I like to think of myself as a blend. I have dual nationality. I was born British, but my heart is very much Portuguese.
The factory house is a grand building. It was not only a place for trade, it was also the social hub for the British community living in Porto. Its libraries extend through several rooms. The ballroom is stately. There is an historical kitchen. The dining room is resplendent. This room is called the dessert room, though that is something of a misnomer.
We don't serve dessert here. We just serve vintage port. This dining room was created solely for the purpose of drinking vintage port. So there was no taint of any food. Nothing could disturb the perfection, any of the nuances. We have lunches every Wednesday, because that is, the tradition continues, because that is when the mail was delivered from the UK by boat. So newspapers, letters, etc. And therefore all the merchants, all the factors would come to the factory house, to the club, to dine, to enjoy a good glass of port and to exchange information.
Among the many portraits that hang in the factory house, there is one of Sir John Croft of the Croft port family. He played a fascinating role in the Napoleonic Wars.
John Croft actually was the fourth of John Croft of the family, known as Jack Croft. He was an incredible person. He spoke 6 languages. He was going to be a spy, a scientist.
Because he was a spy for Wellington, wasn't he? A spy for Wellesley.
Yes, because he spoke 6 languages, so he was someone that could very well build a network of spies and get information and then convert this code into information to be sent to Wellington to get knowledge on what the French were doing.
After the war, many thousands of Portuguese refugees returned to an uncertain future with burned-out farms and slaughtered livestock. Wellesley lobbied the British government to create a fund to provide relief. The British public were also moved by the plight of the Portuguese and held numerous public fundraising events, including a bare-knuckle boxing match staged by gentleman John Jackson. Jack Croft had seen the suffering at first hand and personally set about getting the funds directly to those in need.
he saw that the land of Portugal was completely in misery, because when the French went back, they burnt everything, they destroyed, they killed. And so the ones that survived lived in very miserable conditions. So he decides to do something, and it's when the British government gives a grant of £100,000, plus the people give £70,000. It's a lot of money. It's 17.5 million pounds today. It's a lot of money. Yeah, but the misery was so big.
How did he go about this distribution, and who did he give to? What did he give?
Actually, it took 11 months doing that with a very important Portuguese man, Judge Gaudêncio. And then what they do, they buy seeds, animals like mules, cows, goats, also a lot of medicines, because there are a lot of ill people, and also clothes.
A prized item is the actual wolfskin strongbox that brought the donations to Portugal.
Can I open it?
Yes, yes. Open history.
This is like real treasure box. I mean, it's empty now, but it's still... The history jumps out, doesn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely.
It's extraordinary, and that was stacked with money.
Yeah,
with money.
yeah.
That he...
Money for a very good cause.
Jack Croft and Gaudêncio Torres left Lisbon in September 1811 carrying the box. 11 months and around 5,000 miles later, they had distributed aid to 77,000 families, including 26,000 farmers. They also appointed guardians for over 8,000 orphans. In the years that followed, innkeepers on the Lisbon to Porto road refused to charge Jack for lodgings, food, or for the stabling of his horses. Portugal joined World War I, fighting on the side of the Allies. Portuguese troops fought on the Western Front in Europe and also in West Africa. During World War II, Portugal was under the rule of the dictator António de Oliveira Salazar. Portugal remained officially neutral. If Portugal had entered the war, it would have triggered Spain to side with the Axis powers, and nobody wanted that, certainly not Britain. In 1943, Portugal granted permission for British shipping convoys to use the Azores as a base for shelter, refueling and repair. The Azores are Portuguese islands that sit in the Atlantic, midway between Britain and the United States. It was a vital supply route, blighted by constant German submarine attacks. In his statement to the House of Commons, Winston Churchill began by saying, "I have an announcement to make to the House arising out of the treaty signed between this country and Portugal in the year 1373, between His Majesty King Edward III and King Ferdinand and Queen Eleanor of Portugal." And he went on to conclude, "I take this opportunity of placing on record the appreciation by His Majesty's government of the attitude of the Portuguese government, whose loyalty to their British ally never wavered in the darkest hours of the war." The alliance was invoked again in 1982 when a British task force sailed to the South Atlantic during the Falklands War. The Azores were once more of crucial importance. We have been partners in NATO and for the past half-century also in Europe. Many Brits like me still live here. Among other things, the alliance calls for a perpetual friendship between the two peoples. I'm English, but I live in Portugal, and I feel the warmth of that friendship every day. It is real.